Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. Hi, today is October 15th, 2025. Our episode will be released next week. So, some of the things we are posturing may have been resolved by next week. But I think it's really interesting because there are just so much headlines, starting, China put in a rare earth control, which I believe, and I've mentioned on Twitter that this US and China is entering a new stage of the trade I hate to use the word trade war, is that before mostly US put in sanctions, and if US put in 5 sanctions, China usually respond with 3 and then kind of let it slide for 2. But starting recently and then pretty clear starting last Thursday, it seems like for every US sanction, including those long arm sanctions, what do you mean? For people who are not familiar, long arm sanction means US will tell companies in other countries, not necessarily American companies, to not do business with China. And China is using the similar language in its rare earth export control. Obviously, there are so many headlines. I think I don't know what happened, in China, whether President Xi is, aware of this new regulation, or as the U.S. side says that U.S. side is clearly surprised that China went so quick on going to respond, even though I think for many people like me who are looking at China, it's not a surprise for me. But I think President Trump tweeted 100% tariff on Friday. The market was MSCI China index, they were down in the worst more than 6%. But then President Trump, wrote it again, says, "Oh, we're cool with China, and I'm most likely still going to meet at the sideline at South Korea." Even though President Trump is probably not going for the APEC meeting, which again, too much of politics on that front. But the market now calms down a little bit. But I think overall, U.S.-China is entering a different stage, which means that going forward, U.S. is going to realize that every action is going to meet with the Chinese response. And also, a lot of, I feel like if you read news, a lot of headlines sounds some narrative getting pushed. So I think it's very important for investor to be aware of this, that both sides use news headlines to push their narrative. So I think for now, what really important to remember is first, when China and the US fight, they are also talk on the side. So I know it feels so uncomfortable that you have to deal with a country which both sides see the other not as friendly, yet you really have to deal with it. So I think that part, when you see so much fighting, you also need to be aware there's also a lot of talks, meetings going on in the background. Secondly, I think since we are entering a new regime, so what's be mindful is that in terms of investment, Chinese investment, you still want to own some, right? Because China is now really the only country that has independent set of companies like US. US have Google, China has Baidu, US have Amazon, China has Alibaba. So again, it's not an endorsement of any particular company, but I think it's pretty clear that China right now is also a formidable force in economics. So, even for diversification purposes, you want to own some China. Thirdly, I think if you want more timely news, probably you can follow me on Twitter, because our podcast is every 2 weeks, and we try to be staying very relevant, but headlines change really quickly now, and both the U.S. market and Chinese market are going to be driven by top leadership, in the sense that before, when you're thinking about Chinese equity, that's driven by policy, and then now U.S. equity many times are also going to be influenced by the policy, the so-called government policy from directly from President Trump. So I think next week, what to look for in the next 2 weeks is President Xi and President Trump's meet. On that, I'm slightly positive. I think ultimately China likely buy U.S. soybeans. But I actually did a poll on Twitter, and the result is so close. Like slightly, like 50.5% of people think yes, and the rest thinks no. But I think ultimately something will work out as long as they meet. But the so-called U.S.-China competition is going to be so long-term. The background is still going to be similar. This is not the end of U.S.-China not going after each other. I'm pretty sure something will flare up again. And we just 6 months from April, and I think things will it's important that when these kind of things happen, do not lose sight that at this stage, neither U.S. and China can just, kill the opposite and then be done. So ultimately, they still have to go back to the negotiation table. I'm not saying that's the so-called taco trade at all. Actually, I think you want to know how much risk you can take in your portfolio, and then be patient when these kind of things happens. In terms of Taiwan, something interesting, the opposition party going to have a chairman meeting, and I think the Taiwan risk, I've consistently said for now it's low. I think obviously after 2028, when Taiwan has a presidential election and U.S. has a presidential election, then things get a bit murky. We're just gonna have to wait and see year by year. I think within the next 1 year, there's really very little risk. So again, thank you for listening to us, and feel free to send us messages either on Twitter or on our website, and hopefully bring more insightful China analysis to you. We want to, we still, the thing is, I've stressed that in this relationship, U.S. and China, the consumer discretionary, the consumer tech is not necessarily the main focus anymore. U.S. China are both really focusing on hard tech competition. Software is of course is still very top line, like self-driving, but it's all combined with hard tech like robotics and quantum computing and all those very cutting edge technologies. And China, in every one of those areas, China is behind the US, but not that much behind. Obviously, US is still leading and wants to keep the lead. So for ordinary person, I feel, you can say this is kind of interesting time if there's no war, because we actually is at the forefront of history, and seeing, another two countries going to compete very hard, across industries, across many areas. So thank you, and we hope to continue to bring analysis to you, and you can reach us on our website, on Twitter at Liqian_Ren on Twitter, and then we are on all the podcast channels as well.